Hey, wonderful every day. Here on the 1st of April 2002, a 96-year-old man passed away quietly in an old people's home on the south coast of Finland. He looked small in death. He'd stood only 5 feet tall in his prime, and old age had chunking him further. Still, many years before, he'd been a farmer who'd kept himself to himself. He'd never married and had no children, but the few people who got close enough to think of him as a friend called him Simo in his youth. However many decades earlier, he'd been known by another name, one usually whispered by nervous-looking men in snow-covered forests who scanned the horizon constantly and jumped at every sound. These men had never met Simo and therefore didn't know his real name, so they gave him another one. The White Death. That might seem like a grand title for a diminutive Finnish farmer, but it was a very fitting one because over the space of 98 days in 1939, the quiet, snow-drenched landscape of his native country Simo became death incarnate, a perfect killing machine that snuffed out the lives of men by the hundreds. This is the story of Simo Häyhä, known to his enemies as the White Death, the greatest sniper who ever lived. This story about the greatest sniper who ever lived is incredibly interesting. He had a pretty normal childhood for the time, volunteering in the Civil Guard at the age of 17 and completing his mandatory national service at 19, where he became a member of the Bicycle Battalion, a unit of cycle-riding light infantry, if the idea of soldiers on push bikes sounds a little comical. You might be surprised to learn that at the time, bicycles were considered genuine vehicles of war. They played a significant part in the First World War and were still being used in the Second, albeit in smaller numbers, despite this early brush with the military. Simo had no martial ambitions and every intention of spending his life at home on his farm. So after completing his mandatory service, that's exactly where he went. But over the years, the atmosphere across Europe began to darken, and by the late 1930s, Simo would be called to serve his country in one of its most desperate hours. It started in 1939 as the world teetered on the brink of all-out war when Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression agreement that became known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The deal stunned the world. Not only had the Soviets been negotiating unsuccessfully with the French and British for months at the time, but the Germans and Soviets were longtime adversaries who pretty much hated each other's guts. But as shocking as the pact between the two old rivals was, there was even more to the deal than met the eye, because behind closed doors, a secret protocol had been slipped into the agreement in which Hitler and Stalin had essentially divided the countries of Europe up between them, based on what they called their spheres of influence. Just over a week later, Germany and the dictators jointly invaded Poland, the Germans from the west, and then 16 days later, the Soviets did the same from the east, claiming half of the conquered country each. By the way, the Molotov of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is the very same man for whom the now well-known cocktail, you definitely don't want to drink, was named after during the brief war that was fought between Finland and the Soviet Union after the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the same war that would soon make a living legend at a Simo Häyhä. The Soviets conducted widespread bombing of Finnish cities, but dropping bombs on your neighbors is generally frowned upon by the international community. And so Vyacheslav Molotov, Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, conducted a propaganda campaign insisting his nation wasn't bombing the Finns, but was instead delivering food packages like the good friendly neighbor. It was the Finns demonstrating an admirable sense of humor considering they were getting shell to at the time, started jokingly referring to these bombs as Molotov bread baskets when Soviet tanks began trundling over the border shortly afterwards. The Finns responded by pelting them with improvised bottle-based incendiary devices, which they called Molotov cocktails, a drink to go with the food parcels via Vyacheslav. Molotov had so kindly forced to send them, Anyway, after the German-Soviet invasion of Poland, the Soviets began doling out ultimatums to the other countries deemed to be in their sphere of influence, including Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland. The Baltic states were soon forced to accept Stalin's demands. But the Finns stood firm, turning down his kind offer of handing over a bunch of their land in exchange for not being murdered, their bullying diplomatic approach having failed. The Soviets decided to let their soldiers do the talking, commencing a full-scale invasion of Finland. In November of 1939, the Winter War had begun. Finland is a land of lakes, swamps, and densely packed forests, and when Stalin's army attacked, most of that was buried beneath a thick layer of snow. The challenging conditions made it difficult for the Soviets to successfully deploy the full might of their forces, and the Finns, who were far better prepared, began to engage in their own unique brand of guerrilla warfare. Even so, Finland had a population of just 3.7 million at the time, meaning there were close to 50 Soviets for every single Finn. When the Red Army crossed the border at several strategic points, they brought with them thousands of tanks and aircraft. The Finnish army, on the other hand, had just 32 tanks to its name, along with around 100 aircraft and an unknown number of bicycles armed with really loud bells and those clicky things you put on the spokes. In short, the Finns needed a hero and a short. Hero is exactly what they got. This was very much a David and Goliath clash. But when Goliath turned up to this particular fight, David was nowhere to be seen. You see, he'd hidden himself in a snowbank more than a kilometer away, and he was packing a sniper rifle. Simo's national service had ended a good 14 years before he was called up to fight in the Winter War. But that didn't mean he was rusty in many ways. He'd been in unintentional training ever since he left the army, stalking forests he knew like the back of his hand in search of elusive game. His trusty rifle slung over one shoulder and making the transition from master hunter to god-level sniper turned out to be fairly simple conditions during the Winter War. Were brutal, with temperatures generally fluctuating between -20 and -40 degrees Celsius, but Simo didn't mind. In fact, he didn't even think of the conditions as particularly harsh to him. It was just winter, and so he put on some more clothes and got on with it. The Red Army, on the other hand, was woefully ill-prepared. The men were given standard-issue uniforms in a kind of dark khaki color, meaning they stood out like shining beacons as they patrolled the endless white of the Finnish wilderness. Simo and his fellow snipers, on the other hand, were decked out in pure white camo gear, making them next to invisible. Within days, at the start of the war, it became clear Simo was no ordinary marksman. It wasn't just that he could make shots that were practically impossible to the other men. It was also his machine-like consistency once the target entered his crosshairs. No matter the difficulty of the shot, Simo almost never missed. And yes, it wasn't just his outrageous skill that set him apart. For starters, Simo didn't use the same state-of-the-art sniper rifle with telescopic sights that his fellow soldiers favored, instead using the same old basic rifle he'd been issued years before during his days in the Civil Guard, a far simpler weapon equipped only with iron sights. That's right, as crazy as it sounds, the deadliest sniper in the history of mankind. Didn't even use a scope, and you don't need to play Call of Duty to know that no scopes are hard. The stuff of YouTube compilation legends, but that's just how Simo preferred to do things, and in fact, foregoing the scope had a couple of important benefits that extended his edge on the battlefield. A sniper using a telescopic sight has to raise his head a few centimeters in order to look through the scope, presenting a marginally larger target to the enemy Simo. Also realized that telltale flashes of sunlight from enemy scopes were often what gave them away. Something he knew better than most could be fatal as well. As his unusual choice of weapon, Simo was meticulous in his preparations for battle. He would visit his favorite firing positions in the middle of the night, checking they hadn't been discovered by the enemy. and ready them for action the following day, shaping the snow to better conceal his position and flattening any powder to ensure it didn't puff up when he fired, giving him away. Simo left absolutely nothing to chance, making the most out of every advantage available to him to augment that uncanny marksmanship of his. He even went so far as to keep snow in his mouth while sniping, cooling his breath so it wouldn't be visible after condensing in the frigid air. Had Simo merely been a good shot, he would have most likely come out of the Winter War with scores of confirmed kills to his name. But by combining that remarkable skill level with all of these different tactics, he became a force of nature. The war between Finland and the Soviet Union was brief, lasting just over 100 days, and yet during that time, the man who would become known as the White Death amassed over 500 enemy kills at an average of more than 5 per day. The exact number of confirmed kills is unknown, but most sources put Simo's tally at between 505 and 542 kills. Chris Kyle, subject of the film American Sniper, had 160 confirmed kills to his name, gained across 4 tours of duty during the Iraq War, and 10 years of service. Another legendary sniper hero of the Soviet Union, Vasily Zaitsev, who became known to Western audiences after being played by Jude Law in Enemy at the Gates, is credited with 242 kills during 80 years of service in the Second World War. Simo's kill count dwarfs both of these, and he achieves defeat in a matter of months, not in the better part of a decade and all this, despite using relatively basic gear and not even being a career soldier, unsurprisingly. Rumors of an almost supernatural sniper who never missed began to spread amongst the Red Army soldiers, and the legend of the White Death began to grow. The Soviets became so concerned about the number of men they were losing to this mysterious Finnish ghost, they sent literally scores of their own snipers to hunt him down, but Simo dispatched each and every one of them, becoming more desperate. They tried to bomb Simo out with mortar fire, but he picked his hiding spots carefully, sniping from natural foxholes and deep snowbanks. Nothing less than a direct hit would have taken him out, and since the Soviets were never quite sure exactly where he was, even as he picked them off one by one, they never managed it. That is, until the final week of the war, when an explosive round caught him in the face during a particularly fierce battle. Simo's fellow soldiers later found his body unmoving in the snow, and grieving for their fallen hero, solemnly placed him with the dead. But hours after the battle had ended, a soldier noticed movement amongst the piled bodies, a twitching leg. Remarkably, despite having lost his upper jaw, most of his lower jaw, and the whole of his left cheek, Simo was alive. He was taken to the hospital immediately, where he would remain in a coma for a full week before regaining consciousness. On the day peace was declared with the Soviet Union, his injuries were terrible, and he would require 26 surgeries over the following years to mend the damage to his face, though he remained badly scarred for the rest of his life. The Winter War ended with the Moscow Peace Treaty, in which Finland ceded border territory to the Soviets in exchange for the cessation of hostilities, whilst the Finns ended up losing more lands than the Soviets had demanded before the war. Most observers believe Stalin had meant to seize the entire country by force, something which he was ultimately unable to do so, thanks to the bravery of men like Sema in the face of overwhelming odds. By the end of the war, Simo had become a genuine national hero, and he was promoted from the rank of corporal to second lieutenant as a reward for his service. It remains to this day the single biggest promotion ever given to a soldier in the Finnish army. He was also given a farm. It was called White Lake, a fitting home for the man called the White Death. In his diaries discovered for the first time in 2017, he referred to the staggering number of men he'd killed as his sin list. He rarely talked about the war, but not long before his death, he was asked if he regretted having taken the lives of so many men. His response was typically modest. I did what I was told to do as well as I could. There would be no Finland unless everyone else had done the same. Thanks for watching.